My name is Ryan Wolff, and my project is called Shift in Statecraft, Human Rights and U.S. Intervention in Latin America's Southern Cone During the Late Cold War. This is a presentation based on my work from the History Thesis program. Before we get started, I'd like to take a quick moment to thank Wolff and my advisor, Professor Melissa Teixeira. Furthermore, thank you to Professors Rosenfeld and Azuma, both of whom taught the thesis seminar. And lastly, thank you to my friends and family for the support. Now, into the material. Not going. Oh, there we go. Okay. As you can see on the right of this slide, the Cold War dominated politics starting just after World War II. While this cartoon is not directly related to Latin America, oh wait, this is the wrong slide. There we go. While this cartoon here of Stalin and Greece is not directly related to Latin America, it captures the attitude that much of the US government and populace harbored towards the Soviet Union. Stalin here is literally departing from the path to peace, and this was a real concern for the US, especially when the region at stake hit closer to home. Latin American countries, really since James Monroe's presidency in the 1820s, his Monroe Doctrine closed the Western Hemisphere to European and other influence, were seen by the US as off limits to non-US intervention. And that was definitely not going to soften during the Cold War. That sense of possession has influenced the US-Latin American relationship to a great extent. This JFK quote right over here is from 1958, and his actions during the Cuban Missile Crisis a few years later indicate how seriously he and many others took the Soviet threat when it appeared in the Western Hemisphere. Let's also talk a little about human rights at the time. Today, many people, I'm sure many of you, know of large umbrella organizations like Amnesty International. These are the NGOs that publish reports and advocate for a multitude of causes. But it's important to realize that this was simply not the case before the mid-1960s. It just didn't exist. It took congressional advocates, for example, Representative Donald Frazier, a congressman from Minneapolis, to really advance the cause of human rights in U.S. policymaking. In this thesis, I investigate this shift from a time when human rights was a non-factor. It was seen as more of an internal concern, a country-by-country issue, to playing a real role in international relations. I want to focus on Uruguay and Argentina, two countries in the Southern Cone. As influential historian Greg Grandin referred to Latin America more broadly as, quote, a testing ground, a region where the U.S. first implements policies later seen throughout the world. And finally, I just wanted to put my central claim right at the bottom of this slide, where it says, quote, the U.S. decision to ban military aid to Uruguay and Argentina marks a true inflection point, not because it set the United States on an entirely different path, but because it allows us to examine what different policy choices were possible despite all the constraints of that era. Let's now focus on Uruguay before the aid cutoff. The aid cutoff would be in 1976. Uruguay is, to this day, a small country of about 3.4 million people, and unlike its neighbors, did not really have a bloody history of military coups or military rule in the 20th century. It was actually termed the Switzerland of the Americas for its stable democracy and strong welfare state. But things began to change around the 1950s. As you can see here, gross national product fell by 12% from 1956 to 1972. That's on a net basis. And there were many labor issues throughout this time period, which ultimately were a factor in the implementation of a new constitution in 1966, which expanded the state's police powers and further cracked down on organized labor, leading to more and more chaos. These developments, though, were not terribly concerning to Washington, which was concerned with the Cold War. And under the Nixon administration, Uruguay consisted of 9.5% of total U.S. arms appropriations to Latin America. This continued as President Juan Bordaberry won his election in 1971 and began closely collaborating with the military leaders after he dissolved Congress in 1973. And around this time, abuses against the Uruguayan people dramatically increased, and I have included some examples. The government ranked each citizen according to their perceived loyalty, talking A, B, and C, and often imprisoned the disloyal. One historian that I cited a lot, Debbie Sharnack, estimates that 1 in 50 citizens of all of Uruguay, that's 2% of everybody, were at one point held as political prisoners or worse. And this understandably led to 300,000 out of the 3 million people fleeing Uruguay at some point during the dictatorship, that is between the years of 1976 and 1985. We can see why they fled, really, from this pamphlet over here on the right. This is an Amnesty International report, and it documents multiple cases of violence at the hands of military interrogators. The pamphlet includes civilians who were interrogated based on mere insinuation and innuendo, and who were then murdered for their alleged left-wing ties. The circumstances in Uruguay illuminate the rise of Amnesty and other human rights NGOs, which will be important as I talk about the eventual aid cutoff. It's therefore vital to think about this report in the evolution of the human rights lobby as well. Amnesty, again, had only recently pioneered the development of these sorts of reports, the first of which appeared only in 1965. In these publications, as we see here, activists developed a morally persuasive writing style, which absolutely made good material to showcase at congressional hearings to get policy changed. Now we're gonna move on to Argentina. If I can change the slide, we'll see. Maybe we won't. Um, Now moving on to Argentina. Argentina, like Uruguay, actually, had a very bright moment in the beginning of the 20th century, the very beginning. Argentina was truly a rich country back then, ranking in the top 10 in terms of wealth, population growth, and in other economic metrics. But as time progressed, Argentina started to experience periods of destabilization, which would worsen considerably. Between 1930 and 1976, actually, the country would undergo 9 coups, 2 rigged presidential elections, and 2 presidents appointed by the army. This political instability lent itself to a volatile domestic sphere, again paralleling Uruguay, where the military cracked down to restore order, potentially jeopardizing U.S. support under a future presidential administration if this were to continue. Except when Argentina was really under Juan Perón's leadership, the U.S. supported the country out of Cold War necessity. From 1946 to 1955, and then again from 73 to 74, Juan Perón's position as president presented a challenge to the U.S. because he practiced a policy called the Third Way. And the Third Way consisted of the idea that nations don't actually have any permanent allies or friends, and this led him to be a difficult partner for everyone considerably. This policy alienated both the US and the Soviet Union. So it was very hard to give aid to Argentina when he was in office. But after Perón left office in 1955, the US would up aid to Argentina considerably. And JFK and subsequent presidents gave Argentina hundreds of millions of dollars in both military and economic assistance, justifying it as part of a Cold War strategy. In a win, Argentina helped blockade Cuba, actually, during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And thus, the aid continued to flow throughout the 1960s until Juan Perón returned in 1973 from exile. But Perón only served 9 months, as he then died and was replaced by his wife, Isabel Perón, who was subsequently overthrown by the military, led by General Jorge Videla. The U.S. then resumed aid, and as you can see here, gave Argentina over $30 million each in 1975 and 1976. These transfers happened while the country was highly, highly unstable. And the quote I've included from 1975, right over here, indicates such instability. The military dictatorship would pursue flagrant violations of human rights so often that Ambassador Robert C. Hill, who served under Gerald R. Ford, so this is no friend of the left, considers Argentina an extremely confused and arbitrary environment in which many Argentine citizens are beginning to wonder if they have any protection under the law. The military leader at the time, Jorge Videla, was actually quite open about his attitude towards the country in what came to be known as the Dirty War, commenting right over here, all necessary persons must die to achieve the security of the country. This is a fairly bloody comment, and he followed up his words with action. Patricia Darien, who was a U.S. human rights official in the State Department, further describes the human rights issues in Argentina. On a government visit in 1977, she said the following. She said there were always dead bodies in the street, and the grotesque nature of Argentina was truly something to behold. And she emphasizes the widespread disappearances that were affecting the country as part of the Dirty War. So really, something had to give. And I'm going to highlight three factors in the US that played a key role in the aid cutoff. Distrust of the executive branch, one, Carter's election, and lastly, the continued rise of NGOs. First, the Vietnam War and Watergate led many US citizens to actively mistrust the executive branch. And on the back of this mistrust, Congress gained more influence. Liberal House Democrats, in particular, won in that regard. Also, the election of Jimmy Carter, who would express more concerns for human rights, led to an inevitable confrontation with repressive regimes. And Carter's administration pushed back against what he and his allies termed really a binary choice between anti-communism and human rights. Carter would write later in his memoir in 1982, I was, quote, familiar with the widely accepted arguments that we had to choose between idealism and realism, but I rejected those claims. For example, Patricia Darien, who I mentioned in the previous slide, her position was created within the executive branch, which showcases Carter's approval towards this sort of thing as being deliberately shoehorned into official US policy. The third factor that I think we see is the continued evolution of human rights groups. Before the 1970s, there were no big galas, no K Street lobbying efforts, and no even office of Amnesty International in DC. And Samuel Moyn's book, which I relied on here from 2010, specifically illustrates how human rights groups had historically acted as a vehicle for one particular cause, say like equal pay for women or freedom to practice Christianity in a specific country or region. But in the 1960s and 70s, they would begin to combine multiple causes, which I think we saw in the previous slide with the Amnesty International report of referencing specific people. And therefore, they started issuing these reports, these very persuasive reports, which could be cited on countries. And additionally, human rights worked for everybody at that time. The idea of human rights appealed to politicians across the aisle as they could correctly and accurately attack the Soviet Union for violating human rights by operating a massive gulag system and being repressive towards dissidents. Lastly, NGOs themselves evolved to be more practical and mainstream. And the quote I have here with the arrow, I think, illustrates that particularly well. The dream of revolution really encompassed some of the attitudes of groups in their earlier days when more far-left members railed against consumerism and the desire to resist neocolonialism around the world. This does not really sound like it would have appealed in the midst of the Cold War anti-communist policy, because it really wouldn't. So by leaving behind these sort of more fringe ideologies, human rights advocates were able to better integrate their concepts into US politics. And I argue that such factors that we just talked about led to the possibility for aid cutoffs. And these two aid cutoffs, the first to Uruguay and second in Argentina, were the first time military aid was canceled on human rights grounds by the United States ever. And for the most part, Carter held to his promises to break ties with these countries. Uruguay represented a strategic choice, in particular, for an aid cutoff, as DC policymakers did not regard the opposition to the dictatorship as a communist threat. For Representative Ed Koch, who would become the mayor of New York City later in his career, human rights issues in Uruguay were actually pretty distinct from left-wing communist ideology in their totality. And Koch highlighted Wilson Ferreira, who was the Uruguayan opposition leader, as someone who was particularly compelling. He hailed him really as a moderate Uruguayan democratic leader who polled a plurality of votes. This is all true. Ferreira himself would testify before a hearing that included both Fraser and Koch, and Ferreira would highlight his Western and Christian credentials, and he would really preemptively block any charges that he was somehow friendly to communism. Similar claims were made when characterizing the assassination by the Uruguayan regime of two senators. And the fact that a communist threat in Uruguay really seemed not to exist allowed U.S. legislators to begin to ask themselves, why do I really want to be complicit in these abuses? There's not even a practical justification for it. So their answer to that question was a no. and Congress cut off aid in late 1976. Argentina, however, was a slightly different case, as it was a larger, more strategically important nation. And liberal Democrats in the House of Representatives pursued an aid cutoff really with vigor here, threatening to derail the entire foreign appropriations package for the next year if the cutoff to Argentina wasn't complete. And therefore, because of this gamble, Congress cut all aid to Argentina, and Carter was more than happy to sign that bill. However, as I mentioned, Carter began to recognize eventually Argentina's strategic importance. And Argentina was important due to the fact that it grew large quantities of wheat. And Argentina would sell that wheat to the Soviet Union. And in 1979, the Soviet Union actually invaded Afghanistan, started a war in Afghanistan that would last about 10 years. And the U.S. saw this trade, the selling of wheat to the Soviet Union, when the U.S. would like to place sanctions on any country selling to the Soviet Union at that time, as a threat. So Carter sent an American general named Andrew Goodpaster to Buenos Aires in 1980, which legitimized a little bit Videla's regime. And this tactical choice demonstrated that Carter did, at least sometimes and to an extent, engage in Cold War realpolitik. He was willing to compromise human rights maximalism in the context of Argentina when needed. So Argentina, again, powerful grain exporter, historical ally, larger country. And Uruguay really did not receive any of this kind of treatment. In Uruguay, and to a large extent in Argentina, Carter actually expressed less fear of the communist threat relative to prior presidents and downplayed its significance. Those who presaged this worldview were in Congress and had allies in academia, which we'll now speak about. Okay. To gain a deeper understanding of the Congress-academia connection, I traveled to the Minnesota Historical Society in Minneapolis this summer to examine Congressman Donald Fraser's papers, two of which are right here. Fraser was a progressive who served Minneapolis in the House from 1963 to 1980, and progressives like Fraser evidently relied quite heavily on information from NGOs and academics. And here are two great examples. I was very happy to find these examples in Minneapolis. Both indicate a chain of command-like structure, a real a pathway that one can trace. And on the left is a letter from September 1965, and on the right we have a letter from February 1977. So we're going to start with 1965. Congressman Fraser, who had really just begun serving in the House, was alerted to a specific arms sale of 50 attack bombers to the unstable Argentine government at that time. And this was reported in the local newspaper, the Minneapolis Star, and read about by a University of Minnesota professor named James Beck, who wrote to him about this. And Fraser later, as we see here in this letter, he wrote to the congressional liaison. He wrote to inquire as to the background which would support such a sale, and he received a response actually from an experienced Pentagon arms dealer and contractor. And this contractor told him, this is after the sale had already happened, that the U.S. was fulfilling legitimate internal security needs. See, we have the internal aspect of human rights for Argentina, and the sale fits within U.S. policy. And for the time being, because it's 1965, it did fit within U.S. policy, in fact. And Fraser could really only question a weapons transfer after it had already happened. A decade later, though, and we have the letter on the right, in December 1976, another University of Minnesota professor named David Weisbrot, a different professor, wrote to Fraser. And Weisbrot began making these very specific recommendations. He recommended that Fraser request a government accountability office investigation into whether the State Department was actually complying with the law to cut off aid to Uruguay, as the law actually had already happened. It was very recently passed. And that same day that Fraser read the letter, Fraser wrote a letter to the Secretary of State, Carter's Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, inquiring as to what kinds of military sales have been transacted with the country of Uruguay or are being considered for sale. And sort of through these letters and looking at both of these letters and the change over time, one can see how Fraser leveraged academic findings to pressure the executive branch. The second and maybe more important conclusion from these two documents is that Fraser's status within Washington had clearly changed. Whereas in the 1960s, Fraser wrote to a general department, a congressional liaison, after the weapons transfer occurred. He was now in a position to bring his concerns directly before a cabinet secretary, and a high-level cabinet secretary at that. This comparison exemplifies some of the consequences of entrenching human rights into the U.S. policy arsenal. Now it really is part of the official conversation. So Congress collaborated with academics. Fraser orchestrated staged hearings with dissidents, and organizations like Amnesty vividly described the abuses happening in Uruguay and Argentina. But why should we really care about the aid cutoff? I mean, after all, didn't both dictatorships outlast Carter and fall under Reagan? That is true. But we deeply care because the aid cutoff represents a new world framework introduced in the 1970s that has persisted, arguably, since then. We still have these staged hearings, congressional collaboration with academics, and a highly visible NGO sphere. The human rights movement, at least in discourse, continued even through the Reagan administration, although Reagan was this famous Cold Warrior. Some examples are Vice President at the time, George H.W. Bush, before he became president. He said that tolerance of right-wing paramilitary violence in El Salvador is, quote, just as repugnant as the terrorists of the left. Reagan then actually welcomed Soviet dissidents, multiple of them, to the White House, and they spoke in detail about human rights policy and specifically used those words to show how poorly the Soviet Union treated dissidents. However, there arguably have been presidents on both sides of the aisle who have recently shown signs of jettisoning human rights-based foreign policy. And I think when President Biden promoted human rights in many venues, his rather abrupt withdrawal from Afghanistan of only a few thousand troops contributed to a complete Taliban takeover. And because of that, women and girls experienced near total deprivation of human rights. And President Trump, for his part, has clearly rejected norms. We can look at Venezuela as a test case to see his rhetoric change. So President Trump in 2020 talked about Venezuela a lot. He said that, quote, Maduro is an illegitimate ruler, a tyrant who brutalizes his people. And in his State of the Union in 2020, that year, he praised a man called Juan Guaido, who was the opposition leader at the time to Maduro. But in 2025, as highlighted by this picture of a alleged drug boat strike in the Caribbean, Trump's rhetoric was no longer focused on human rights, even though he was criticizing the exact same people. Rather, it was focused on America First concerns. And Trump argued that Maduro, now before he captured him, was a narco-terrorist flooding the U.S. with drugs, addicting the U.S. population to fentanyl. So as quickly as organizations like Amnesty moved into our national discourse, so too can their ideas fall out of favor. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. My topic today is about the most exciting country for the end of a conference, Canada. Everyone loves talking about Canada, so I said it'll just wake everyone up. But seriously speaking, this past summer, a British Columbia Supreme Court decision made headlines across Canada and somewhat globally, and sent many Canadians into a frenzy when it declared that the Canadian Crown title to a large area of land near Vancouver was actually invalid. In fact, the judge ruled that the land still belonged to the Cowichan tribe under their Aboriginal title. That right had not been extinguished over the centuries of which Canada had existed. The judge called Canada to begin discussions with the Cowichan tribe to determine what they should do with this land. In a world where often Indigenous rights and self-determination is viewed as tragic, of course, and something to discuss, but often not something that's really fixable, kind of an unchangeable element of history, this was a major breakthrough. The judge explains this decision as a result of reconciliation. which is an interesting idea to say reconciliation is not only about building relationships between people and building bonds, as we would expect when we talk about reconciling relationships and moving forward from conflict, but also somehow about land claims. The judge bases this argument in the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. My question from this is, how did this Truth and Reconciliation Commission redefine reconciliation in such a way that now land claims were able to be settled and Indigenous title was able to be restored in Canada in a groundbreaking decision? So first, to give a little background to the context of this particular commission, and then we'll go into the genre of these commissions as a whole, and that will bring us all the way back around in a circle. But first, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created in response to the history of Indian residential schools. These schools were created towards the foundation of Canada, and they were created to house and teach Indigenous children with the hope of integrating them into the white man's ways, often run by churches, teaching them the ways of Christianity, and overall trying to assimilate them into Canada as a whole. In the 1980s, however, a pattern of sexual and physical abuse in the schools came out, and the chief of the First Nations at the time, Phil Fontaine, came out with his own story of abuse at the schools. This was brought into the public eye as a major issue. Following this, there were also many, many lawsuits. By 2005, there were 15,000 individual lawsuits and about a dozen class action suits in Canadian courts regarding the Indian residential schools. This created potentially significant material and reputational liability for Canada if the whole world were to figure out what had happened and if they had to pay all of these lawsuits fines. So they decided that they would settle with the First Nations advocates and find a solution. Now, the solution included a few different things in the agreement. Some of those were included reparations or healing practices, but one of those was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which we had mentioned in the court decision. Now, to understand why First Nations advocates would choose to argue for a report as a solution to all of these cases, we have to understand the history of these truth commissions, how they became Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, and then how First Nations advocates strategically use this format to advocate for more rights. So, the origin of these truth commissions actually come a little bit after the time period of Ryan's talk in 1980s in Latin America. Now, they were going through many transitions with the fall of dictatorships, and they were trying to find ways to address their past. For instance, in Argentina, the new president decided that they needed to do something about the many forced disappearances that had occurred over the previous regime. The problem was that given that these were forced disappearances, they couldn't have a trial. The witnesses were disappeared. They weren't there to offer witness. But at the same time, the president needed a way to give the country some sort of closure or understanding of what had happened over the past few years. So he commissioned a commission, which basically explored thousands and thousands of documents from that time period, engaged with the amount of witnesses that they could to offer a comprehensive report on what had happened in the previous decade. What the commission found was about 9,000 forced disappearances and murders, along with the locations of several mass burial sites. This commission found a way to uncover the truth of what had happened to the people of the state. And this was repeated in several other Latin American countries as they went through similar processes. Then, a few years later, in the 1990s, after the fall of apartheid, South Africa decided to make its own Truth Commission. This commission is perhaps the most well-known globally. It was very highly publicized, and if you'd ever heard about Truth and Reconciliation Commissions before today, you probably heard about it in the context of South Africa. A big reason for the publicity of this was due to the amnesty hearings. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was the primary architect of this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, decided amongst with other people, but created this idea of amnesty hearings where people can come forward, perpetrators of crimes during apartheid could come forward and they could share what their crime was in exchange for amnesty. He believed that this act of confession was so humiliating that it could serve as a form of punishment. Moreover, he hoped that this would bring forgiveness between different people through restoring both the humanity of the perpetrator and the victim. He believed that this could create a new sense of national unity. Thus, they termed it the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as truth was intended to bring reconciliation. Now, following South Africa's example, this became pretty standard practice among the global community when dealing with a new regime or the aftermath of a civil war or just simply a pattern of human rights abuses in a country. A few years following it, either the UN or another international body or domestic forces within the state itself would come and draft one of these reports. By some estimates, there have been about 90 in the past 50 years. And when the UN would discuss this, they would discuss it within the framework of the duty to remember or the right to know. This is a duty of the state to tell its people about its history so that they shouldn't be lost in the dark, not knowing what happened. And they framed this in terms of the people's national heritage. Now, not only had truth commissions turned from something that could reveal the truth of a missing part of a nation's history to bringing forgiveness and reconciliation, but now it could build a national identity. So this background on what a Truth and Reconciliation Commission is in gathering all these types of information in order to bring national unity and national identity, it's an interesting fact that the First Nations advocates decided for this to be a part of the settlement agreement. They're not a state. They don't seem to be trying to build Canada's national identity in the same way. How was this useful? So I argue that they used this framework through the upper hand that they kind of had in the settlement agreement. They realized that this framework and the terms that it invokes could actually be used strategically to advocate for more rights. In particular, the term reconciliation. Now, in the first few paragraphs of the report, reconciliation is used in the way that we would expect it to be. They discuss reconciliation as like a family moving forward from a history of violence. They discuss the violence, they talk it out, they figure out a new path forward, and then they move forward together as a family. This seems very similar to Desmond Tutu's articulation of reconciliation, as one nation coming together, rebuilding stronger. However, they emphasize that this is not coming simply from international forces or from Western ideas, but this comes from Indigenous healing practices themselves. It discusses prayer circles, healing circles, covenant chains that they would polish at different points to emphasize a focus on a continued relationship, and wampum belts, which would be these belts kind of created with patterns that would indicate the relationship that they were building through new alliances. Now, this seemed to be very similar to the original formatting of TRCs. But as the commission continued, they integrated new ideas of reconciliation in what some scholars call the carnival of ideas in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but I view as a slightly more strategic move. Now, one element of these Indigenous practices is that they were often based in group relationships and collective identities rather than individual rights. The wampum belt, for example, wasn't necessarily about individuals coming together, but it was about two nations coming together, make an alliance. The belt depicted here is actually from the Treaty of Niagara between the British settlers and the Indigenous nations, indicating their shared commitment to each of their national sovereignty and their commitment to work together. The commissioners frame Canada's history in the context of these treaties, stating that without these treaties, Canada would have no right to a nation. Instead of Canada's existence being predicated on the discovery of the lands, it's predicated on the treaties that followed. This reshapes Canadian identity from one that stands within itself to one that's predicated on the existence of another nation. If Indigenous nations don't exist, these treaties don't exist, and Canada doesn't have a right to exist either. Therefore, Canadian identity must include both the right of Indigenous nations to exist and Canada as a nation. They put this in sharp contrast with the history of the Indian residential schools, whose goal was to assimilate Indigenous people into Canada, to adopt white man's ways, and exist as one polity. Now, in this quote, for example, of absorbing Indigenous people into the Canadian body politic, it seems to use liberal democratic imagery. This seems great. We want everybody to be part of the body politic, to have rights. But it misses a crucial point that they weren't looking to be part of the Canadian body politic. They already had their own nation. By working to create the Canadian nation, in fact, Canada destroyed another one. The commissioners then frame this as a project of reconciliation. They frame reconciliation not only as creating new relationships between people, but as reconciling the coexistence of two of two facts: the coexistence of the sovereignty of Indigenous people and the sovereignty of Canada. This therefore requires a new reckoning of self-determination and self-government, like a process that was invoked in the treaties. And this was the term that was then used in the Cowichan case to make a new claim for land, to say that actually we need to restore what had happened. Reconciliation can only be brought by understanding the two realities that exist on this land. In this way, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission wasn't only a symbolic gesture of history or relationship building, but rather the redefinition of Canada's history and the term reconciliation created a legal reality. This is significant not only for the change that it created, but also for the long history of Indigenous advocacy that preceded it. As early as 1921, Deskaha of the Haudenosaunee Nation went to the League of Nations to complain about encroachment on Haudenosaunee land by Canadian authorities. He went with a passport from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy to argue that he too had a nation which had rights. Unfortunately, the UK and Canada both prevented him from speaking, stating that this was a Canadian domestic issue. But it demonstrates that this idea of having independent rights and existing on the basis of the treaties had long been a element of Indigenous advocacy. In the 1980s as well, around the same time when the history of the Indian residential schools was coming to light, this issue came to the forefront. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau decided that he wanted to repatriate the Canadian Constitution from the UK. For many decades, the Canadian Constitution was under the power of the UK in terms of if they wanted to make any amendments, they had to go to the Parliament. This was because of disputes between provinces. But after Quebec had a failed referendum for independence, Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau decided that he needed to find a way to unify Canada, and he thought that this constitution was the way to do so. But Indigenous groups were very unhappy about this because he sought to repatriate only the British North America Act without any of the treaties attached to it. This would essentially eliminate their rights, their collective identity. When they appealed to the Prime Minister, he said it is inconceivable that one section of the nation should have a treaty with another section of the nation. He still viewed it from this perspective of individual rights alone, rather than the true collective identities behind it. They therefore traveled to London on what they called the Constitution Express to appeal to many different officials, including representatives of the Queen, representatives of the Archbishop of Canterbury. When that failed, they then moved on to the UN, where they met with 14 different diplomatic missions. Unfortunately, they were not given a seat at the table in negotiating the concept of repatriation. But their efforts did make an impact, as their advocacy added in Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution, which protected the treaty rights. It also led to the formation of the Assembly of First Nations, which played a crucial role in the settlement agreement. Now, this demonstrates that the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been the culmination of a long history of advocacy, trying to demonstrate that Indigenous people had collective rights and collective identity, and the relationship between Canada and the nations should be a nation-to-nation basis, rather than one of state and subject or state and minority. Now, of course, this is far from over. While there have been more agreements, this is another agreement that was taking place between the Canadian government and the Cowichan tribe in Canada. There's still much more to go, a further way to go. Moreover, the ultimate goal of the Indigenous nations isn't fully articulated. Most of the time, there's this idea of multiple sovereignties, the idea that they want both membership in the Indigenous nation as well as Canada, and their status at this time is still in flux. At the same time, this demonstrates how there's a significant reorientation of relationship between Canada and the nations. And other countries have actually followed suit. Norway, Finland, and Sweden have each had their own Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to deal with their treatment of the Sami people. And overall, the story of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission demonstrates how a change in truth, whether that's historical, whether that's the story that a nation tells about itself, or the definition of a word like reconciliation, can craft a legal reality that shifts relationships and can even create new nations. Thank you.
I will start with a couple that crossed my mind as I was listening. One is the same question I asked of the previous panel, where if there were, through this whole year, methodological or other kinds of conversations with other fellows that helped you or inspired you, I would love to hear about it. And also, I would love to hear from everyone, what was maybe the most surprising finding as part of doing your research? Feel free to maybe start with Carol.
I think to answer your first question, when we were doing my workshopping session, I think something that really stood out to me was I was stuck on a specific source for one of the posters that I used, and then everybody jumped on their laptops and started searching for it too. I think that was, for me, particularly inspiring because I was just like I was really touched. I just think it was really nice to see that y'all were so excited about my work as well. That was really I was really appreciative of that, and I think that sort of helped me propel it forward, keep going with it. And then the second thing, honestly, I think the most surprising thing that I found wasn't necessarily a piece of propaganda, but when I was looking for anything related to, obviously, as I was researching US and Japanese relations during World War II, a lot of stuff about the internment camps popped up, and I found out that there was, well, one of the sources that I was looking at was a Girl Scouts magazine, and I found out that there was a Girl Scout troop in an internment camp, and I was very intrigued by that. I think it was sort of, to say that commonality, I think, doesn't fully describe it. I'm trying to think of the wording, but I think what stood out to me about that and what was so interesting was at a time when they're actively being separated and being seen or being told that they are other, doing something that any average American girl was doing, just in a different place, I think was really interesting.
Sure. Yep. So I think this one may come from Eric, and Eric was in my history seminar, and now he's a Wolf fellow. So he's kind of read my stuff multiple times. But one thing that I think I improved on was kind of a background on the human rights injecting being injected into the discourse. And I would say that's some of the feedback that I think I was given by him to focus perhaps more on the evolution of what people thought of as human rights. Because I think our idea of the Geneva Convention or of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it may be a term, but may mean different things in different decades. So I think that recognizing that and making sure to include that was valuable, and also similar in that something that surprised me was kind of similar to that, but the fact that a lot of these institutions that we know now, I think I talked about this a little in my presentation, but a lot of the institutions that are active now that promote human rights in our discourse today really were non-existent before, and it just shows you how fleeting trends can be. And it was very surprising to learn that people kind of considered the idea to be a intra-country, intra-nation issue.
I would say my general inspiration, I guess, was actually reading everybody else's work each week. I think that the way people presented their writing and the narrative style with which they wrote, even when it was a research paper, actually really pushed me to reframe how I was writing and kind of how I articulate the research I had done rather than necessarily in a formulaic way to make it more of a story. which I thought made it a lot more fun. And I think the most surprising thing I found was this idea of like the sacred trust between the First Nations of Canada and the British government, that a lot of the First Nations advocates actually kind of look back at the initial colonial stages as like this golden era in which they had respectful relationships with each other and they were treated as a nation and they had these treaties with each other, even when like the reality wasn't necessarily all that perfect. But they kind of look back to that as like the golden era, that which they want to return to. And what they like take more frustration with is the Canadian nationalism, which I thought was very interesting because I kind of had like grouped together like nationalism and like self-determination, and we could throw Indigenous rights in there, and then colonialism, and then kind of realizing like how this all interacts with each other and isn't necessarily linear was super interesting, and something that like made me look at everything else with more of a different lens.
Questions? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, next.
Hello. I have a question for Noah and for Kara. My question for Noah relates to, I guess, the confessions. First of all, I really love your work with the Native and Indigenous studies, especially for Canadian nations. And I was just wondering, in terms of the confessions, was there a specific way that those confessions of crimes were structured? Like, I assume that some people would try to self-justify, or they would try to, like, try to use euphemisms, but I just was curious about that.
Yeah. It actually was that like people would apply for amnesty and then they would go through the hearing, and then there would be like this panel of judges and they would determine whether or not they actually thought it was politically motivated. So it's actually interesting, the context of apartheid, because a lot of apartheid was motivated by racism, the line that they chose between what was political and what was racist. So it was kind of like people would self-justify, definitely. But like the judges kind of like took that into account and made a ruling. Oftentimes it was like kind of seemed arbitrary. Also to note that I think 80% of the people who applied for amnesty were actually anti-apartheid activists, because it was kind of supposed to be done like on an equal footing. And like the idea was that by everybody confessing what they had done wrong, now we're all going to unite, which added like a very different element to it, I think, than like Canada's commission had.
Thank you so much. And then just my question to Kara is, you talked about your visit to the Imperial Museum, and I was just wondering just kind of like what you see there and just like how that informed or maybe shaped your project.
I think the one thing specific that stood out to me at the museum, there was a piece of children's clothing from Japan. It was a vest. And it had like missiles and tanks printed on it, and like faces of children, but like dressed up as soldiers. And I was looking at that and I was like, wow, that's literally my whole project right there. So I think that seeing that specifically made me start thinking about incorporating Japan in some way towards my project. And then from there, I ended up choosing to just do the comparison between the US and Japan.
Thank you. All of your projects were really good. So
Thank you. Thanks, Sally. Yeah.
I have a question for Kara as well. I was curious. So you mentioned a little bit about how you were looking at the threads of kind of like that post-war action, Pearl Harbor, so on and so forth. So something that I think we look at from like the political science lens is like the concept of like Truman's approval ratings and everything falling so bad, and like the atomic bomb switching from like this weapon of war to like more like being withheld and removed from like defense actions. I'm curious if you found that despite all of this propaganda, the lasting impact of it was perhaps less in some ways because of like the should we say immorality of like dropping the atomic bomb, which almost erased like the impact that like that propaganda had caused, or if you saw like that like in the long term that there was differences.
I think kind of I think that had a lot to do with it. I mentioned during my presentation that following the conclusion of World War II, Japan was occupied by the US. And during that time, there was more of an effort to, after spending so much time dehumanizing Japanese people, there was an effort to, I guess the word would be rehumanize. And so there was a lot of material that would go out that would talk about, like, it will also depict children and saying, like, nobody's born necessarily different or anything like that. So kind of encouraging more of like a tolerance and trying to gain a better understanding of people regardless of how they look. I think kind of also to tie it back to something else that I looked at, I mentioned Dr. Seuss's political cartoons. Following World War II, he also took a trip to Japan, and then wrote Horton Hears a Who, which is an allegory for the US occupation. I think that, so I would say that because of that, because of those actions specifically, there was a lot of effort to not necessarily like go back on what the messaging was during the war, if that makes sense.
Okay, so Arwen, yes, please.
Awesome. I think you all had really cool projects. My question is for Ryan. Specifically, what caught my attention about your presentation was the future of human rights as a whole as a more state-focused thing. And I was curious what you think about the power of more like non-governmental organizations or like the UN as a whole for regulating human rights. Like, do you think they're still going to be effective in the future, or is it just not going to work?
Well, thank you. That's a very interesting question. I think that perhaps not even related to the UN, but social media and the fact that people have potentially become a little desensitized to the types of successful hearings that went on in the 1970s and 1980s, because a lot of the hearings were uh, showing, these pamphlets and these reports. And now I think that, 10-second clips with things that may not be fully contextualized are the most effective at driving our discourse. So I I don't know about a sort of UN solution. I just think that social media has made our politics quite fragmented, which which is very unproductive for a centralized sort of solution.
Christina. Oh, sorry. Eric first and then Christina.
I also had a question for Ryan. So I was struck by your discussion of how other historical actors were instrumental in forming, like the framework of human rights that congressmen like Frazier forwarded. And I was wondering, like, as we've seen human rights policy norms shift in the last 10 years, like you mentioned in your last couple of slides, do we find that it's the same kinds of historical actors that are being the legislators, or are those norms shifting as well?
Yeah, I think that's also a great question. I think broadly, to an extent, definitely. Academia and academia back then and now, I think, is a very strong purveyor of this type of ideology. Professors still testify, economists testify, uh, heads of NGOs testify all the time, and lobbyists are still very important in terms of just even bringing issues to the attention of the legislators. I think that's actually something quite overlooked by our media, that a lot of the job is just even to be in the right place and bring your issue to focus. But I would go back and I would say that social media has been so effective in displacing many of these traditional structures that perhaps now it's more influencer based, or a politician maybe who is just retired and now has a podcast, and that sort of issue is the new human rights purveyor. So that's really what I would say, that they haven't fully been replaced by, by all accounts, but it's been kind of supplemented or complemented by these new participants.
Christina?
Oh, sorry. Thank you. My question is for Noah. I was really interested by your discussion of the nation and the state as different concepts because I think sometimes they're colloquially used interchangeably. Um, and so, especially, I mean, you mentioned that the First Nations are nations and not states, but I'm wondering where, if you could talk a little bit more about that distinction, but also specifically, like, is there tension maybe between Canada as a nation and Canada as a state? And where do you see that distinction, if there is one?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I entirely have an answer. I think it is interesting in terms of the idea, especially when that in general, since this like commission and the kind of this national reckoning, there kind of has been a movement towards greater self-determination of Indigenous nations. Like there are three separate groups of Indigenous nations. So one of them is First Nations, another one is Inuit nations, which they've actually have like now an semi-autonomous region that's becoming more increasingly autonomous. But kind of was interesting to see like Indigenous scholars kind of grappling with this idea of like they don't know if they fully want to be a state, but they definitely want to be recognized as an independent nation, and kind of what kind of responsibilities does a state have versus having a group identity. Like the idea, like one thing that just like comes to mind is a little bit like the economy. What would happen to the economy if suddenly they were to be split off? And they're definitely interrelated. I would say for Canada as a nation versus a state is also like, I think that's something I thought about a little bit less, but definitely is an element that plays a central role, especially like thinking about from Indigenous people's perspectives, as in if they view themselves as part of a separate nation from Canadians, but at the same time part of the same state, that kind of brings in these tensions and kind of grappling with figuring out this identity. I think a lot of this is kind of unresolved. Like I didn't find anything that had clear articulations. Like people were definitely advocating for land back or for more self-government or for different elements, but nothing was so cohesive as to be like, this is the vision that we all have. That helps.
Yeah, thank you.
The question. Sorry, Sergio.
Yeah, so I have a question for Ryan. I was wondering if you find anything about like how the change in the perspective of human rights in foreign policy impacted internally the point of view of human rights in the US.
Okay. Yeah. I may not have a direct answer to that in terms of the public opinion of like a public opinion poll or anything, but I definitely think that people became significantly more aware and receptive to a human rights argument. What I found especially interesting when I went to the archives, because there was really, I mean, 50% of all of the documents, I think, were correspondence between this Congressman Fraser and his constituents and just people who sent him letters. They weren't even his constituents. But what I found was that the whether it was due to the large exile populations from Uruguay and Argentina that left those countries and came to the United States, I think that that was a factor in ginning up a lot of concern for human rights, and the almost systematization of the human rights groups led many more people who were not from Argentina or from Uruguay, to rally around the cause of human rights and write letters and advocate for aid cutoffs to Argentina or Uruguay. Significant numbers of people who had no connection to these countries joined chapters of Amnesty International. I encountered like a list of people who signed a petition who were part of the Northern Virginia Amnesty International chapter. These were not, exiles themselves. All that is to say, I don't have a poll for you, but I think that conclusion that you just made is absolutely correct. I think.
Eric.
I had a quick question for Kara. I was wondering,
One of the things that I thought was really interesting was when you put up like side-by-side comparisons between propaganda in Japan and in the US. And I was sort of struck by how similar a lot of it was. And I know that we can attribute some of that to just it being like part of like the genre of wartime propaganda. But I was wondering, like, did you ever come across instances where like the authors or the illustrators of these propaganda pieces were actually in contact with one another? Like, was it ever, did they ever circulate in other countries, or were they more siloed within like the bounds of the country itself?
Um, for my everything that I had, I did not find anything like that. However, you have inspired me to go look. So I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like maybe post-war that might have been the case, considering there was again occupation, so there were US citizens and Japanese citizens interacting with each other a lot more. I also could see that maybe being the case through Japanese citizens or Japanese Americans based in the US. I I don't have any like actual confirmation, but I could see where there's like possibilities or potential for that to happen. And that is something that I will definitely look into.
Time for maybe one final question. Yes.
For all three of you. This slide, please.
This is a great panel. For all three of you, there's so many things that you have to develop as a researcher. Like you have to develop a good work schedule that works for you. You have to develop a writerly voice. You have to figure out which archives are worth going to, how to write a grant to get to the archives. And so my question for the three of you is, do you feel like that you've also developed a methodology that works for you, like an approach to your materials that works for you? Like, you know, that there's certain things that have to sort of come together and be put in dialogue for you to do the best kind of work that you can do.
I mean, for myself, I think my start was very slow, even in figuring out the exact topic. I think I work best when like I start with the primary sources and then kind of see like what I find interesting there, what doesn't seem to make sense, and kind of look outwards from there. And I think that's when like I started to build up more speed, was with kind of looking at the sources themselves. And then like that would guide me to more places. So I think it's not that I'm not so systematic about it.
Yeah, I think for me, something that I realized was that to be successful, oftentimes I, write my argument or my claim based on whatever evidence I have at the time, but having the ability and the time and the wherewithal to be able to shift your argument in terms of new evidence that may crop up that you may encounter is something that I think is valuable.
I think for me, I think starting so big did kind of help me. It took a little bit of time to realize like that was never going to happen, but I think that the process of elimination is something that I'm better at than sort of like already identifying just a set topic. So starting so big and then realizing, oh, I really am fascinated by Dr. Seuss, and then going from there and then seeing, okay, I'm seeing a lot more material from like World War II, and this is interesting. And then narrowing it down more and more. I think that is sort of how I was able to do my best work. I also think that just having some sort of like visual aspect was really beneficial for me. I'm not always great at like more theoretical stuff, but having something that I could like look at right in front of my face or go online and find a wonderful archive of like imagery was really beneficial for me as well.
So starting big and finishing strong, I think, is a theme that carries through. So before I hand things over to the executive committee, please join me in thanking the wonderful panelists. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Undergraduate Humanities Forum, I want to thank you all for being here today and for joining us in what has been a year-long conversation on a deceptively simple question: what is truth? When we began this semester, I think many of us were assuming that truth was something we would gradually clarify, maybe something that we would define more precisely, or perhaps even arrive at the end. But what we encountered instead was something far more difficult, but also very more interesting. We did not so much arrive at truth as we learned how unstable, contested, and also historically situated it is. And perhaps more importantly, we learned how to sit with that instability, that uncomfort, rather than trying to resolve it very quickly. Behind the scenes, I want to share that this seminar was not a smooth progression of polished ideas. It was more often a series of revisions, moments where our arguments simply didn't work. At some point this year, I think every one of us said something like, "What was I trying to say here?" Or, "I think I need to rethink my argument," or, "I'm not prepared enough," or, "How can I incorporate that critique?" And those moments were not failures. They were simply part of the work. One of the most difficult and ultimately most valuable aspects of this seminar was its interdisciplinary nature. We were constantly pushed to make our ideas intelligible to people who did not already share our vocabulary, our methods, or even our sense of what counts as evidence. It is one thing to develop an argument within our field, but it is something entirely different to explain it to a historian, a literary scholar, a pre-med political scientist, all of them in the same room, and to have to hold it up. That process was challenging, but it was also what made the work better. I think it forced clarity on us. It exposed assumptions, and it made us more careful thinkers. And just as importantly, it created a kind of intellectual community that is not easy to build, one where we were able to learn from approaches we otherwise would not have encountered. What made this seminar meaningful was not only the ideas we developed, but the way we engaged with each other seriously, critically, and generously. It was a space where disagreement was not something to avoid, but something that we could work on. What emerged from that process was not just a collection of individual papers, but a set of conversations that you saw unfold throughout the day today. And I'll pass it to Izzy to walk us through how these conversations took shape across the panels.
Across the panels today, we encountered several distinct but connected ways of thinking about truth. In tracing truth, we saw that truth has a history. What counts as fact, what counts as evidence, and who is recognized as an authority are not static, unchanging categories. They are shaped by specific historical contexts that do not always share those assumptions. Or, to put it a little differently, what we consider reliable knowledge today would not always have counted as truth in another time. In essence, what counts as fact depends on who you ask. In lived truth, the question became more intimate and more difficult. Truth was no longer just something to verify, but something to experience and inhabit. We were pushed to ask, who is allowed to hold truth? Who determines its terms? And what lies beyond the limits of the categories we use to understand experience? In narrating truth, we were reminded that truth is never independent from form. Stories do not simply transmit the truth, they shape it. Voice, perspective, and genre all influence what can be said, what can be heard, and what is remembered. And finally, in state-sanctioned truth, we confronted the political aspect of truth. We saw how institutions produce and authorize official narratives, how they regulate memory, how they determine which truths are recognized and which ones are suppressed. So across these panels, truth emerges something historically conditioned, ethically contested, narratively shaped, and politically structured. Taken together, these panels suggest something important. Truth is not singular, it's not neutral, and it's not guaranteed. And yet, none of this means that truth doesn't matter. If anything, it means that it matters more. Because if truth were simple, it would not require this kind of work that we have all pursued this year as Wolf Fellows. So if there's one thing this seminar has taught us, it is not that truth is impossible or that it dissolves under scrutiny. It is that truth requires interpretation, judgment, and responsibility. It requires us to be precise in our claims, attentive to context, and willing to revise our assumptions, which we did a lot of this year. And perhaps most importantly, it requires us to remain in conversation with texts, with histories, and with each other. We want to end by returning briefly to the people who made this event, this whole year, possible, to our fellows. Thank you for your intellectual courage, for taking risks, for asking difficult questions, and for pushing your ideas further than what was often comfortable.
To our faculty and moderators, thank you for your guidance, your challenges, and your commitment to this inquiry.
And a special thank you to Emily Steiner for organizing such thoughtful and engaging field trips, for being present with us in every session, for offering her generous and incisive insight on our projects, and for helping us prepare for this conference while also fostering a space where we could truly grow and bond intellectually as a group.
And to the Wolf Humanities Center, thank you for creating a space where this kind of work can happen, a space where ideas are taken seriously and where conversations like this one are possible.
We would also like to extend a special thanks to Yu Ayoko Kano, Director of the Wolf Humanities Center, Julia Verkolantsev, Topic Director of the Kuskowski Fellows, and the incredible staff who made this program possible, especially Erin Bailey, Pamela Horn, and Sarah Varney, who have been with us since the very beginning of this special show.
The question of truth doesn't end here. If anything, it becomes more urgent, and now it turns to you. As you live today, we invite you to reflect on the assumptions you carry about what counts as truth, what you take as evidence, what voices you trust, and which narratives feel natural or unquestioned. And we invite you to reconsider those assumptions in light of the work you saw today. I think the work of humanities is not to settle that question once and for all, or to continue asking it more carefully, more critically, and more responsible. As I saw some fellows discussing outside, it's very interesting that we can keep finding insights and connections of the panels. And I think that's part of the work of humanities, to keep inquiry and keep asking. So thank you.